Madagascar. Not the movie, but the country. Madagascar is an island of the east coast of the African continent. It's interesting to note that this country features in our daily lives, and most of us are not conscious of that. Many of us in this room are wearing perfume. Many of us in this room may have shared birthday cakes with loved ones. Many of us in this room may have had a nice scoop of ice cream on a hot summer's day, or lit a fragrant candle during your me time as you relax. In all those moments, Madagascar has been present. And the way Madagascar has been present in those moments is through its key commodity export, vanilla, the vanilla pod. You see, Madagascar as a country supplies 80% of global vanilla requirements. Of all the vanilla that is consumed in the world, 80% of it originates from Madagascar. So Madagascar is quite key to industries that require this commodity. However, what is curious is that Madagascar exports the majority, if not all, of the vanilla pods that it grows all the way to Europe. The pods are exported to Europe. When they get there, they are further processed, and they are then integrated into different industries, the perfume industry, the confectionery industry, and the like. These products then find their way back to the African continent, and we buy them at a premium because they've got higher value that has been added to them. And this Madagascar vanilla story is the quintessential story of the manner in which the African continent trades with the world. I can give you many examples. I can give you an example of copper from Zambia that will be exported to China and come back to the continent in the form of copper cables and copper wire. And we buy it at a premium. I can give you an example of the cocoa from West Africa, Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana, that will be exported to Europe and come back to the continent, and we buy it as delicious Belgian chocolate. This is the story of the African trade interface. I want us to begin to get to the grips with the reason why our structure of trade as a continent is the way it is. It's been mentioned previously that the level of trade within the African continent is very low, 16%. If we compare this level of intra-Africa trade to, for example, how Europe trades with itself, 60% of European trade happens amongst European countries, 60%. 40% of trade in North America happens amongst the North American countries. Similarly with ASEAN, it's over 30%. So there's a lot of room for growth in this space. And there's an urgency that Africa needs to begin to trade more with itself precisely because of the value and the benefit that trade brings to economic prosperity. If our continent is going to grow, if we're going to create the jobs that we need to create, particularly as part of our post-COVID reconstruction, we have to make sure that we use trade as a key instrument for transformation of the African economy. Madagascar still remains one of the poorest countries in the world. This country that exports 80% of vanilla to the world still has a per capita income of $1,700 US. Compare that to US per capita income of 63,000. Compare that to even South Africa of 13,000. That means that this profile of Africa, of continuing to trade with the rest of the world, sending primary commodities, whether they're agricultural or mineral, and buying back value-added commodities is keeping us in the perpetual poverty cycle. And this is an issue that we need to confront and to address as African economies. Why is the African trade profile like this? It's important that we embed our current trade profile as a continent in our history, because we would be remiss if we do not acknowledge the fact that we are still perpetuating colonial patterns of production, colonial patterns of consumption, and colonial patterns of distribution on this continent. In the 1800s, when colonial masters from different parts of the world, Europe and everywhere else, landed on the African continent, it was part of course, the extension of the imperialist agenda, but the priority was one and one alone: to exploit Africa's natural and human resources for the betterment and the growth of countries outside of the continent. And that's exactly how then the trade profile of Africa was set up. It was about extracting natural resources and sending them to other countries to help with their development and industrialization. It's a pity that we still have somewhat a similar profile that we've had since the colonial times. And that is why it becomes urgent that we address this fundamental challenge, the fundamental challenge of reversing the colonial patterns of production, consumption, and distribution on the African continent. One of the key things that we need to look at when it comes to production is the fact that we as Africa, we represent 17% of the global population. But we only contribute 2% to global manufacturing. And we only have a share of 3% of global trade. This confirms the fact that our pattern of production is still very much in the manner in which it was set a long time ago. We remain still largely exporters of raw materials, and we still remain importers of value-added products. Let's look at our patterns of consumption. Similarly, there's still a fundamental preference for products that are coming from outside of the continent. This is reflected in the fact that we are not trading too much with one another. 84% of our trade is with the rest of the world. Even if we move beyond the trade realm, levels of intra-African investments themselves leave a lot to be desired. Then we go to our distribution patterns. All you need to do is to take a bird's eye view at the infrastructure map of the African continent, and you'll begin to see that our infrastructure is still structured in a way that it leads from a natural resource point out to the nearest exit port. Even today, it's a very extractive plan of infrastructure. There's very little infrastructure that connects different African countries, and functional, viable infrastructure that does the same. If, for example, we've got a rail line that moves from one country to another that could possibly facilitate trade, you then are confronted with issues of gauges, that the gauges don't match, so the interconnectivity is interrupted. Some of the roads are overburdened. So even in terms of our own infrastructure planning, there's still a lot to be done to make sure that we have cross-border infrastructure that we start to build and to create on the African continent. What are the implications of all of this to us? If we continue to not focus on adding value to our primary commodities, we are costing ourselves as Africans critical jobs. We're costing ourselves critical skills. We're costing ourselves an ability to move up the value chain and become a viable player in the global economy. We cannot even begin to start talking about participation of Africa in the fourth industrial revolution if we are still struggling with the second industrial revolution matters. It is therefore very urgent that all of us as the African citizenry begin to address the issue and redress and correct the colonial patterns of production, consumption, and distribution on the African continent. Now, how can we work together as governments, as citizens, as the global community even, to address this matter and to contribute to increasing our levels of intra-Africa trade? Our African leaders, African Union leaders, will be holding an extraordinary summit on the 5th of December this year, in about 2 weeks' time. And the priority of that summit will be to look at how we activate our Continental Free Trade Agreement. It's going to be quite a seminal conversation. It's going to be quite a seminal summit that our leaders are going to have, because there has been a recognition that indeed intra-Africa trade is important. And in the form of the Continental Free Trade Agreement, we have begun as Africa, after many, many years, to really put and activate our intra-Africa trade agenda. The vision is that this intra-Africa trade agreement, Continental FTA, will begin to operate on the 1st of January 2021. But I must mention that the Continental Free Trade Agreement at this point will mainly focus on addressing the issue of tariffs, to simplify taxes that we pay when we trade amongst ourselves. That goes a long way, of course, in facilitating our trade, but we still need to go deeper if we're going to improve our levels of trade on the continent. We have to prioritize the issue of infrastructure development on the continent. And my urge is that when the leaders of Africa meet in December, the priority focus is how do we begin to create an infrastructure build on the continent that is cross-border in nature. Because the only way that we can begin to facilitate trade on this continent is if we have the right infrastructure that joins the countries and is not just about the extractive infrastructure build. So I encourage that our leaders take a firm decision on this matter, because many, many African countries, as we speak, have infrastructure plans for themselves as part of recovery and economic stimulus post-COVID. But the question is, are the countries talking to one another so that whatever infrastructure plan and build stimulates trade and is not just isolated to one country? So it's important that our leaders begin to have these conversations, because cross-border infrastructure will also force us to deal with functionality of borders themselves, so that the transit of people, movement of goods at the borders, the regulatory requirements that we have, we begin to look at them strategically and cooperatively. And it will take us having a cross-border infrastructure plan for Africa to get to deal with all those issues. On the issue of reversing the colonial consumption patterns, I think it behooves us as African citizens to begin to demand African-made products. This preference as well for external products and not encouraging enough industries and not encouraging enough African industries and consuming African products, it's also not very helpful, because trade happens where there is demand, and we need to be deliberate as Africans insofar as the demand. Finally, on the issue as well of production, One of the key areas that we need to look at as Africans, and also as a global community, is the issue of facilitating intra-African investments, particularly in the productive sectors. Africans need to begin to invest in each other's economies so that we can raise the levels of production and begin to produce product that we can trade amongst ourselves. It's one thing to have frameworks that facilitate trade among ourselves. It's one thing to build the infrastructure that facilitate trade among ourselves. But if we do not produce, and if we're not deliberate about the facilitation of investments that are going to make sure that we produce, again, that is not going to help us to reverse our current situation. So the call to action really to the African diaspora, to African consumers, to African private sector, is to look at ways that we can aggregate intra-African investments, to look at ways that we can raise the level of production on this continent. So in conclusion, I think all of us need to internalize the fact that it is our responsibility to reverse these patterns of production, consumption, and distribution on the continent that we inherited from colonial times. And each of us have a role to play, be it investments, be it how we consume, be it decisions and infrastructure planning and integration planning that we take at political level. We all need to work together to make sure that this works. We all need to make sure that the intra-Africa trade agreement, the CFTA, is a functional agreement, and we all have to make sure that we protect it in any way that we can, because intra-Africa trade matters. Thank you.